Hello and welcome to Murder Analysed. I'm Christina Moore. Now today's case is a murder case, but I'm going to really talk about the murderer, Colin Pitchfork, and about the DNA and how DNA has developed into what it is today. So in this case, it's the first real case in the UK of where DNA fingerprinting really solved this crime. But what the DNA testing did was not only solve a crime, it also showed that a man that would have gone to prison for this murder was innocent. So it's quite a landmark case, this, but it is about a murder of two young girls. So this case can be disturbing. I think more this is about the science. This is about the case itself and the development of DNA and how we've used it from then to now. So Colin Pitchfork, he was born on the 23rd of March 1960. This is another English case. He is a convicted murderer and rapist, and as we go along you'll see just how bad this man was. His two victims were 15-year-old at the time of their deaths. Bit of distance between them, but this case is really more about the DNA. But I do talk about the murders, and then we will also talk about Colin Pitchfork, his life, working life. He was married with 2 children, all that stuff. But also, again, we're going to then talk about our legal system. And when a judge says that you are a danger to society and puts you away for a very long time, then how that on appeal is dropped down, and then again when they come up for parole, whether they get it or not. So there's a lot in this case. It's a very interesting case, and I've had a lot of people that have emailed me that are students, law students, criminology students and stuff, so this is really one I think for them as well. If you're interested in the history of DNA, if you're interested in our system, justice system, judicial system as it is, this is a case for you. But again, this is about murder and rape of women. So, warning there for you. So, Colin Pitchfork first murdered, I think in 1983. I think it was in November 1983. Then there was a gap between that murder and the second murder, and that was in 1986, again in July 1986. And this mass screening in this area was then undertaken. So they needed to screen as many people as they could, not for DNA, because the DNA at that point wasn't really around as we know it today. But they did blood tests and things. They tested the men's blood. So this community, this police force, was so intent on getting this man that they tried absolutely everything. And give it to this police force, give it to this certain police officer especially, that really went out of his way, this detective, to try and solve this case. And it was from that led on to a lot of other stuff. So when we look at his arrest in September 1987, that was really the result. So I think what we'll do now is we'll go back to the beginning with Colin Pitchfork, about him, so you can understand where he was sort of coming from. Because yes, he was a murderer, but he was also a rapist. Quite serious one, actually. So Colin Pitchfork's early years at school and stuff, he was quite a loner, I think, but he did show behaviours from a very early age towards women and relationships. He wasn't your typical young lad that could handle or understand how to approach a woman. He was quite well known to be, as he got a little bit older, in his teens, to be quite he would just say things which probably not socially acceptable towards women. He was very flirtatious, but he was very, very, degrading in what he said. And I think it's what he thought in his mind he would just say. So if he liked a woman, he would say it sort of to her. So he didn't have that social ability that a lot of people have, where they may think things but they don't say them. Colin Pitchfork what didn't have that. Also, what happened with Colin Pitchfork in his younger years, teenage years, leading up before he got married in 1981, was that he would expose himself to women. And that's a sort of a sign of things to come later on, because there's usually an acceleration. He wanted that reaction. He wanted them to see him. He liked that fear sometimes. And people laugh when they say about these men exposing themselves, but to a woman, that can be really, really upsetting and also frightening, because you don't know what they're going to do. And so with Colin Pitchfork, I think he exposed himself to over 100 women in them early days. As I say, he married in 1981, and he married I think she was a social worker, and he had 2 children with her. But in this time of this marriage, he then was still escalating. He had stopped sort of, showing himself, exposing himself, because he was charged with that. But this was before the marriage, and he sort of calmed down a bit on the marriage. But in 1983, he committed his first murder. So in November 1983, he murdered Linda Mann. Now, she was only 15 at the time, and she was on her way home from her babysitting. And instead of taking a normal route, I think she took a different route, and she never returned home. And that was the last sort of time that her parents had seen her. But when she didn't return home, the parents called the police and things, and they did find her body a little while later on. But she was, very young, 15, looked 15 as well. Just finished babysitting, just on her way home. And then who did she see? It was Colin Pitchfork. So she was found the next morning, because the parents had searched, the neighbours had searched, the police had searched, everyone had searched this girl. And she was found dead the next morning, and she had been raped and strangled. And on a deserted footpath, and it was known as locally as the Black Pad. So that was his first murder. Now, he'd only got married in 1981, so he'd already stopped exposing himself from a young teenager, young adolescent, up to getting married. But now he's married. He's only been married a few years, and now he's done his first murder. This murder set off a really big investigation, but we are talking about 1983, and this is when DNA, yes, it was around, but it wasn't. When you are looking at a rape case, you are looking, yes, you're keeping specimens and you're taking blood tests and things like this, because that's what you want. So you can tell a lot from a blood test, but you can't tell who done it. You can tell a lot, but you couldn't tell that. So this police had a lot of, work ahead of them, really, because there was no witnesses here. No one saw anything. As I always say, in 1983, we didn't have CCTVs everywhere like we've got now. We didn't have DNA like we've got now. So this man really went free for a good few years. So when we talk about in 1983, and we talk about this, the forensic science, what was around in that time, that the police were using and the scientists were using to try and find killers. Because it was so difficult in the 80s, I think, before DNA really come out, to really find evidence. So they did find that it was an A-type blood. The enzyme profile was matched to only about 10% of the males, and there was no other leads at all. But that was the only lead they had, that they knew it was A positive, A-type blood, and it was about 10% of that community that would have had that. So that did narrow the scale. But when you're talking about villages and towns, and when we talk about with profile, when you're profiling someone and you're profiling a murderer, if they murder in one certain village, they would usually be a 5-mile radius, maybe a little bit outer than that, of where a killer or a rapist usually would work. So when you look at that, then you've got 10% of not only that village, but not that village and that village, and that there is a lot of then the 10% of the males then go to quite a rate, and that would have took a lot of screening to find even then 10%. So it was a very, very difficult task for these police officers. But I'll give them that. They really, really tried. But on the 31st of July 1986, a second victim was murdered. And she was 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth. And she had left her home to visit a friend's house. Her parents were expecting her home about 9:30 p.m. that night. She never turned up. That was it. She was never seen. And then I think when she failed, when she failed to return home, they did call the police. And then, because I think they'd had this murder 3 years prior, the police were already thinking, this isn't good. Same age girl. You know, we're now talking about two 15-year-olds now that have been murdered, or one murdered, one disappearing. And so the police were on it in quite a quick way. And I think they found her body about 2 days later in some wooded area, and it was near a footpath called 10 Pound Lane. So again, when you look at the MO of this killer, you had the victims that were the same age, look quite similar actually as well. They were both found in lanes or cut-throughs, and they were both raped and strangled. So now we have a man that's now got 2 murders, and they need to catch him, because even though there were gaps, he could do it again, and he may not leave as long a gap as he did before, and the police knew this. So now they're really, really looking now for this man. So when they did the blood test that they'd done in the first time to look, they could now tell that the same killer had killed both girls. So it wasn't just about the motive, the MO. It was about, now they had scientific proof that the same man killed these 2 girls. And the second girl wasn't just strangled and murdered, but she was severely beaten. So he was very angry, and so even the crimes now were escalating. She probably fought back, and that's probably why she was more viciously attacked than the first one. Or he was literally just escalating to where he was now playing his fantasies out, and that would be even to seriously beat and wound before he actually strangled and killed her. So the police knew they had to get him, and they now knew that this was the same person that they were looking for, that had killed these 2 girls, one in 1983 and one in 1986. So now let's talk about the DNA. So in 1985, Alec Jeffries, he was a genetic researcher, and he worked at the University of Leicester, and he developed the DNA profile along with Peter Gill and David Warrant, and they were all the Forensic Science Service, so they all worked together. So now when we talk about the DNA from a victim of rape and murder, to separate the female DNA, the victim's DNA, from the male sperm DNA was difficult. You could take a DNA profile, but it would never be right. They needed a way to separate the different DNAs. And in 1985, this group of men, these forensic scientists, were able to do that. So, and also they were able to do it to older settings of DNA. So you had all these samples of DNA, which yes, you could tell certain things from, but to tell the person's DNA, the person you was looking for, you needed to be able to separate first to get each individual DNA from one sample. But then also the technique of taking it from older DNA was then difficult as well. So in 1985, this is what these scientific forensic scientists became able to do, and really this is what broke this case. And I think that's when they could then take away the vaginal cells and the sperm cells. So we knew then this was her DNA because it's come from her. We knew it was her. That we knew that they could then separate that there was nothing within themselves that would be anything other than her DNA. And also the same with the male DNA. The minute the sperm when was able to be separated and them two strands of DNA were separate, that's then that changed everything in the way we police today and the way we investigate today. So really from 1985, everything changed. Now, there was a police officer, a detective that worked on this case. I can't remember his name now, but a really good detective, who read an article in the newspaper about this DNA profiling and how now that they could do this. So he thought, I need help. So he went to the university and he went to this forensic scientist and asked them for help with this case. Because yes, they had the A positive, the A blood type, and that 10% of that community had it. But what they didn't have was the ability to find, even if they found that 10%, who was the perpetrator out of this 10%. That could never have been done. So he really, and it was just by chance, I think, that he read this newspaper article about this new DNA technique. He approached them and they offered to help with this case. Without this case wouldn't have been solved, or if it had been solved, it would have been the wrong person would have gone to prison for this murder, without a doubt. So now this sequence of DNA and how they do it is now used in every rape case and every murder case, because it's the only way that you can now make sure you've got the right person for that crime. So in the midst of all this going on, where they're testing for blood and they're testing for DNA and they're testing all this stuff, there was a prime suspect, and they arrested this prime suspect, and his name was Richard Buckland, and he was a local 17-year-old lad. And he had learning difficulties, and I think he revealed knowledge of Ashworth's body, of Dawn Ashworth's body. I think he may have seen her lying there after she's dead. But we are talking about someone now, youth, that with mental disorder, he had very severe learning difficulties, and I think he may have come across the body because he seemed to know things about where she was. So of course the police at that time then assumed that he had done it, and that was their prime suspect because they didn't have anybody else, and he seemed to have knowledge of where this body was. So I think in that way, yes, the police were right to arrest him, but I think if he'd gone to court without DNA evidence, this boy would have been put in prison and charged with this murder, and he hadn't done it. So when they tested all this DNA, and when they tested the semen samples against what was found in the two bodies, one, it turned out that it wasn't Buckland, and so this is where DNA, for the first time in this country, allowed an innocent person to go free. But what it also did then was show that the semen taken from the two girls was of the same person, at this time unknown. So the DNA profiling had already worked, I suppose, in a way to eliminate suspects. So the police, if they hadn't had that DNA testing, the police would have thought that this case had been solved, and this man, Colin Pitchfork, would have gone on to murder more. So this case is really, really exciting if you think about it in a DNA perspective. And I think what it shows is that these two girls, yes, they were murdered, and they were murdered by Colin Pitchfork. But what come from their murders, really, and from the investigation side of things, from this detective that just seen this ad in this paper, shocking, yes, that they was murdered, but they saved so many lives since then from the techniques and stuff that now we've developed from this case. So this is, yes, a shocking case because two 15-year-old girls were murdered, and they were murdered in a terrible murder and rape and beaten by this man. But they got an innocent man off, and in the end, DNA the development of DNA from their cases solved this crime and potentially stopped many more crimes from taking place. And I think if the family have anything, at least they have that they can think their children didn't die in vain. And I think this is an important part of this case, because their legacy has to continue on. And I think it's shocking as we go into the next part of this case of how the judicial system in this country is shocking. So what happened was, now they know they can separate these samples, the sample of the semen and stuff, so they knew now who they was looking for, had a single DNA sample ready to go. And so the detectives then decided to do a mass screening, the same as they'd done with the blood. They now wanted a mass screening of DNA. So Colin Pitchfork had worked, I think since 1970 odd, in a bakery, and he'd worked there for a very long time. And he was, everyone in these villages were asked in the surrounding area, because they'd come out their 5-mile radius, a bit more than that I think, to take these samples from all the men in this area, because they wanted to catch this killer. It was a massive task. It took about 6 months to do that. But Colin Pitchfork worked in this bakery, and he was known in this bakery, and he used to go to the local pub. It was very, well liked, family man by this stage. No one knew about his previous of exposing himself. And he set himself up for life. They said he was very weird towards women. He'd never left that part about how he spoke about women and how he spoke in front of women. He never left that. But they didn't sort of see him as a murderer. They didn't see him as a rapist and a murderer. But as these people were doing their testing, and everyone would volunteer to go and do their test, give the name, Colin Pitchfork was in a pub one night, and a man, he was talking to one of his friends, and he said, "Oh, I can't do this DNA, this blood test. I can't do it, because I've already covered for a mate, and now they're going to ask me, why did you do that?" So he said to his friend, "Could you just go and do the blood test? I'll give you my ID and say you're me." So the friend said yes, because he thought we didn't want him to get any trouble if he'd already done it for somebody else. But what they didn't know was there was a woman in that pub listening to that conversation, and she reported it to the police the next day. So on the 19th of September 1987, Colin Pitchfork was arrested. During the subsequent questioning, Pitchfork admitted exposing himself to more than 1,000 women. 1,000 women. I mean, 1,000 women. This man had been doing this for so long. He did say he'd done that, and he just had a compulsion, he said, to do it. He couldn't help himself. If he saw a woman on her own, he would expose himself. And for him, that gave him this thrill. But he didn't really want to say anything else about the murders and stuff. He really didn't want to say it about that. So he later, he said, he after a lot of questioning by these police, and because they knew now they had DNA, and I think he knew because he knew about the DNA, and he knew about it so much that he didn't want to take the blood test. He'd got someone else to do it for him. So he knew if they had this DNA on him, he would be caught. So, okay, at first, yes, he said about this, exposed himself to over 1,000 women over his period of time. And then he said he did move on to sexual assault, so he had raped a few, still not giving too much away about what he'd done. I think, and then he says he progressed on to strangling them because he didn't want them to reveal who he was. That was why he said he did it. I don't believe that. I think when you move and when you start off at exposing yourself, then you move on to the rape side, then you move on to the rape, the beating and strangulation. It isn't then about protecting who you are. It's about now that you are a serial killer. You are now enjoying what you do. And Colin Pitchfork enjoyed what he was doing. So yes, a lot of murderers do murder you because they don't want you to say who they are. And, you know, of course, if you're alive, you're going to say. But I think with Colin Pitchfork, it was just an escalation for him. He would have murdered anyway. He could have put a mask on if he just wanted to rape someone, but he didn't. His whole intention as he was escalating up to that was to kill. And he would have continued to kill if he hadn't been caught by this DNA. So the Lord Chief Justice at the time set a minimum term for Colin Pitchfork of 30 years. You know, and I always say about it, but in 2009, again, Pitchfork appealed his sentence and it was reduced to 28 years. You know, I slate our system all the time anyway, but when a judge who's heard all this case, you know, and the Lord Chief Justice heard all this case, he's heard all the evidence, you know now, he's admitted to expose himself to over 1,000 women, he's admitted to sexual assaults and rapes, he's admitted now to murders of two 15-year-old girls, and a judge then sentences you to 30 years, but you go to appeal and they drop it to 28. Even them 2 years is telling him something, because again, we have these minimum tariffs. Now, so he gets 28 years. Now, so in 2009, you've got this man now being educated because he's been in prison now since 1987, 1988 time. He's now gone to prison, and because he's a long-term prisoner, we're now going to educate him, and I've got no problem with that because these people are in prison for a very long time, and sometimes re-education and stuff can help. But this man, I don't think, should ever have been released. He should never be released. So we've educated him now to degree level, okay? So there's a lot of people out there that haven't done any crimes at all, that can't afford to go to university and get a degree, and we're not giving them as much help. So I have got an issue with that. But then he starts to do paintings and stuff like this, and then his artwork goes on exhibitions and sells like £600 at a time. So now we're having, what are we now doing? We're now allowing people who have done crimes to make money because of who they are. Well, the public went mad, and so they should. And his then works were taken down and not sold. And any money that man should have made should have gone then to a victim fund, because no criminal should contribute or be able to have money from, and loads of them have, believe it, loads of them have made loads of money. I can't tell you how many have made loads of money, £400,000-500,000 some have made. You know, Manson murders alone, some of them killers have made quite a lot of money. I don't agree with it. If they're going to make money, it should then go to the victims or their families. It should not go to them. So I've got a big thing about that as well. But enough with my ranting. We will carry on. So now let's talk about the appeals board. Another one that gets me going, really. So in 2016, 24th of April 2016, the Parole Board of England and Wales heard Pitchfork's case. Because, you know, he wanted early release and he wanted to get out on parole because he's changed. You know, I'm an educated man now. You've educated me. I'm different. I'm changed. Even though in 1987 he's telling you he had this compulsion. He couldn't help himself to, in the end, kill. To expose, to rape, to kill. So what's changed? What, a degree has changed this compulsion? I don't think so. But I think you have now the families of the two murdered girls, these 15-year-old victims of this heinous crime, really, from this man who now says, I'm reformed, I'm different. And I know that you have, you know, his team that's helping him saying, yes, this has been done, he's done this and he's done that. He may have done that, but what he's really done is murdered two young girls. And God knows what else he's done, because I always say it, we only know what this man wasn't going to say unless he was convicted of something, you know, had evidence. He never was going to come forward and, you know, say, I'm sorry, I've done this because I had this compulsion, this man would still continue to kill. So I can understand why these families have gone to this parole board and said no, and have tried to continually say, don't let him out, he is a danger to society. You have the Lord Chief Justice saying he's a danger to society. But then what happens in April 2016, this parole board announced, okay, that Pitchfork, his petition was turned down to get out. He isn't getting out. But what they did do is then they moved him to an open prison. Now, in our system, when you then come off what you may call an A-class category or a B-class category, or in this case a C or a D-class category, because now you've moved him from a prison, which is high security, because this is what this man needs, then to allow him to go to an open prison. Now you're looking at the parole board releasing you at some time, because you've gone from this high security prison to low security prison to where now you're allowed out for day trips on your own, unsupervised, and you may go out at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're back by 5. And this is exactly what has happened to Colin Pitchfork. It was actually said that he could have got parole in 2020, but at the moment he hasn't got it. We're now in January the 3rd, 2021. He will get parole. So I think in 2017, Pitchfork was seen in Bristol, out and about, on his own. So, do I believe in our justice system is going to change? I don't know, because what we've done now is we've moved this man from these prisons. We've moved him now from high security. We've moved him now into an open prison. We're now allowing him day trips out. Unsupervised day trips out. A man that in 1987 has told you his compulsion, he can't help himself but to expose himself. He has raped, he's sexually assaulted, he's murdered. And in 2017, he's in Bristol on a day out on his own. Now, he's going to be out very shortly, if he's not out already. I don't think he got out in 2020. I can't find anything on him yet, but he will be released out very shortly. On his next parole hearing, without a doubt, Colin Pitchfork will be out. So, these two girls, yes, they died. They were murdered by this man. But what these girls did, and their cases did, was change the way that we investigate and solve crimes in this country. We now have a DNA database, and we're going to be doing the case. The next case coming up is the Sally Ann Bowen case, and that's where now we talk about the DNA and the mass testing of DNA and the database of DNA that's kept on there. So this has been the DNA case of Colin Pitchfork, really. A murderer, a person that exposed himself, raped, beaten, murdered 2 15-year-olds. Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. And really is about to be released at any point. I don't think there's much more I can say on this case, really, to show you the truth. Apart from I'm so glad that the way now that we use DNA to solve crimes much faster than this man. If we had had DNA when Linda Mann was murdered, the first victim, we would have caught him before he had a chance to do it to anybody else. So thank you for watching. I hope that you've found this case really interesting. You know what to do. Thumbs up if you've liked it. You can subscribe on our logo that Lacey puts up there for you to do. You can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. So until the next time, bye bye.